We are beginning an in-depth examination today. We're looking into a case that for a long time has been one of Georgia's most difficult, most enduring mysteries. It's the disappearance and, well, the subsequent investigation into the death of Tara Grinstead.
It's just a profoundly tragic story. It's centered on this highly regarded community member whose sudden vanishing it completely shocked a small southern town. And it kicked off this incredibly complex investigation that would span, almost 2 decades.
It's so important as we get into this that we approach the material with the respect and the sensitivity that it demands. Our focus here, as we analyze the facts and the really demanding legal timeline, is to understand what happened to Tara Faye Grinstead and then to understand the judicial process that followed.
Absolutely. The goal is to synthesize all this information. There's so much of it surrounding her disappearance and the court proceedings that came years later. We're going to try to extract those factual milestones, that precise timeline, to give you a complete analytical perspective on the whole tragedy.
From a cold case that went on for years to a very, very complicated conclusion in the courtroom. So let's start with who Tara Grinstead was. I think her profile really makes the impact of her disappearance all the more profound.
It does. She was born November 14, 1974, in Hawkinsville, Georgia. And she wasn't just, a resident there. She was an essential part of the community fabric through her profession.
She was a teacher.
Exactly. A pillar of the local educational system. Since 1998, she'd been a history teacher at Irwin County High School in Ocilla. Education was clearly a driving passion for her. You can see it in her own background.
Right. She had her degree from Middle Georgia College and then went on to get a master's.
A master's in education from Valdosta State University, which she completed in 2003. I mean, that just shows you how deeply invested she was in her career and, by extension, in her students.
And beyond the teaching, there's this other part of her life that really illustrates her drive, her focus. And that's her involvement in the pageant world. And it wasn't just a hobby. It was, for her, a means to an end for her own educational goals.
That's a great point. In 1999, she won the Miss Tifton title. She went on to compete in the Miss Georgia Beauty pageant. And this might seem like a, secondary detail, but the sources really emphasized that she leveraged that success. She was strategic.
How so?
Well, she used the prize money she won from the pageants to help fund her college education. It just paints this picture of a highly ambitious, really motivated woman who is meticulously planning her future.
So that context is crucial. Here you have a young woman, 30 years old, successful, incredibly well-regarded, and maybe most importantly, reliable, especially in a very small community. And that reliability is key to how quickly the alarm bells went off when she vanished on October 22, 2005.
And to just frame the length of this legal marathon, she wasn't formally declared legally dead in absentia until December 2010.
5 full years after she went missing.
5 years. And that declaration of death in absentia, it's an important legal demarcation. It provides legal finality for things like, an estate or insurance, but it offers absolutely no emotional resolution.
None at all.
So for years, the community had to live with that specific tension. A legal acknowledgement of death, but with zero knowledge of the facts surrounding it.
Let's transition now to that initial shock. The immediate events of October 2005. The police response was incredibly swift, and that was mainly due to the specific timeline of her last known activities.
Right. The sources detail her final weekend very clearly. On Saturday night, October 22, 2005, she was quite busy. She'd been at a local beauty pageant where she was mentoring and coaching contestants.
Which ties right back into her own background.
Exactly. And then later that evening, she attended a social gathering, a barbecue. So she was active, she was visible, she was engaging with her community right up until the point she went home.
And the discovery that something was fundamentally wrong, it hinged entirely on her dedication to her job.
Absolutely. The timeline is stark. When she didn't show up for work on Monday morning, October 24th, it immediately triggered concern. Her coworkers knew this was completely out of character.
So they called the police right away.
Immediately. And officers went to the home she lived in alone there in Ocilla.
And the initial assessment of her home, what they found there, it was a scene that was immediately puzzling. It just resisted any easy explanation. What did the investigators find, and what was missing?
This is really the first critical piece of the forensic story. Investigators found her car parked outside. That suggested she had, in fact, made it home after the barbecue.
Okay, so she got home.
It seems so. And crucially, they found her cell phone inside the house. You have to think, in modern missing persons cases, tracking the phone is often the very first step. But here, The phone was there, but the owner was gone.
And what about the missing items? Did they establish any kind of pattern?
That's just it. They didn't really establish a clear pattern. Her purse and her keys were gone. But the GBI investigators, who were called in very quickly, noted two major and very perplexing absences.
Which were?
There were no signs of forced entry into the home, and there was absolutely no sign of a struggle inside.
No struggle at all.
None. And this strongly suggested one of two things. Either she knew the person who came into her home, or she was caught completely off guard and incapacitated so quickly that she couldn't leave any evidence of resistance.
And that specific combination, no struggle, no forced entry, the phone present but the owner gone, that immediately signaled to local law enforcement that this was way beyond a simple missing person case.
It required immediate escalation.
Exactly. The local police chief recognized the severity of it instantly. They contacted the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the GBI.
And the reason they gave was that they just felt something was wrong, that the scale of the case was beyond the resources of a small-town police department. So the rapid involvement of a state agency really showed how profound that initial concern was.
The sources also give us a glimpse into the emotional vacuum this created in Ocilla. I mean, it's hard to overstate the impact of a mystery like this on such a tight-knit community.
It was a collective trauma. The principal of Irwin County High School, a man named Bobby Connor, he provided some context that really captures that emotion. He noted, and I'm quoting here, "We're a small community, and this has really touched home because it is something you read about happening elsewhere."
It's always something that happens somewhere else until it isn't.
Precisely. And he also emphasized Carr's personality. He said, this is someone with a tremendous magnetic personality, and the kids just love her. And that quote, it just anchors the whole case in that real-world consequence. It reminds us why this remained so high profile for so long.
Let's move into those long, frustrating years, the cold case phase. This spans from about 2008 up until the breakthrough in 2017. And this section really highlights the persistence that was required of law enforcement and also the unexpected role the media played in just keeping the story alive.
Well, for years, the case needed constant oxygen to stay viable. It really did. And that sustained attention came, in part, from the national media. In 2008, CBS News' 48 Hours Mystery did a significant report on it.
And what was striking about that report was its attempt to place the Grinstead case into a broader context of similar puzzling disappearances, right?
Yes, they noted the similarities to the case of Jennifer Kess, who vanished from Orlando, Florida, just 3 months after Tara Grinstead.
And drawing those links, I mean, that's a standard investigative technique. You look for serial patterns, you try to generate new tips, even if those patterns don't ultimately lead to a direct connection between the two cases.
Right. But the most important development from that time, it concerned a tiny, critical piece of forensic evidence found right near her house.
The latex glove.
The latex glove. And the male DNA found on it. GBI agent Gary Rothwell, he was interviewed for that 48 Hours piece, and he revealed this detail which had become absolutely central to their investigation. He described the glove as being found in her yard, just a stone's throw from her front stoop.
And the fact that it was found so close to the front entrance, that's telling. It implies the person wearing it was either preparing to enter or had just left or was doing something right there at the threshold of the home.
Exactly. It wasn't something tossed away a mile down the road. Rothwell called the DNA on that glove a critical element to solving the case. They confirmed it belonged to a male.
But the challenge, as it turned out, was immense.
It was. Investigators tested that DNA against dozens of men associated with Tara Grinstead friends, ex-boyfriends, people questioned early on, and nothing. No success.
And of course, they took the next logical step. They entered that genetic profile into the CODIS system, the national database, and the state database. But the issue for years was the DNA had no match.
And that's the cold case paradox, isn't it? You have definitive forensic evidence, a DNA sample from the possible perpetrator. But if that person has never been arrested for a crime that requires a DNA sample, they're just not in the database.
A ghost.
A ghost. The physical evidence was there, but the identity remained completely locked away. It forced investigators back to just painstaking conventional detective work.
And as the years dragged on, that vacuum of information, especially in a case that was getting national attention, unfortunately created space for malicious actors, which led to that bizarre hoax in 2009.
The Catch Me Killer hoax. It was a profound drain on investigative resources. And I can only imagine the distress it caused the family. In February 2009, these videos started circulating online. A man, disguising his voice and his face, claimed to be a serial killer responsible for 16 female victims.
And he specifically mentioned Grinstead.
He did. He specifically named her. So a specificity of that claim required an immediate full-scale investigation, despite the suspicious nature of a killer advertising his crimes online.
Of course, you have to take it seriously.
You have to. Authorities tracked the source pretty quickly. They determined the videos were created by a 27-year-old man named Andrew Haley. The official conclusion was that the videos were a bizarre, elaborate hoax.
So while that successfully eliminated Haley as a lead, the cost was the time and the resources spent chasing down that lie, time that couldn't be used on genuine leads.
It's such a common challenge in these high-profile cold cases, separating the desperate attempts for attention from credible information.
But despite these setbacks, the GBI was resolute. They were public in stating that the case was never truly abandoned.
That's right. In 2011, 6 years after the disappearance, the chief investigator gave an update. He firmly stated the case has never gone cold. And what's more, the agency confirmed that leads were still coming in on a weekly basis.
Which really demonstrates that the community and the public had not forgotten Tara Grinstead.
No. And that sustained engagement is so often the difference between a case that stays closed forever and one that eventually, finally, sees a breakthrough.
And that leads us to the unexpected catalyst that really proved the importance of keeping that momentum. The power of non-traditional media, specifically a podcast.
The role of the Up and Vanish podcast is a fascinating and potent example of modern investigative journalism. It focused intensely on the Grinstead case from 2016 to 2017. And officials and media sources alike, they credited the podcast for helping shed new light on the evidence, and maybe most importantly, for reigniting public interest.
Let's analyze that influence a bit more. When a case is truly cold, what does shedding new light actually mean in practical terms? How did an independent audio show succeed where years of GBI work had, stalled?
Well, it's multi-layered. First, the format itself allows for this exhaustive review of old evidence, of old interviews, and it's often from a slightly different perspective than law enforcement. Sometimes they can spot connections that were missed.
A fresh set of eyes.
A fresh set of eyes, exactly. And second, and this is crucial, it creates sustained public pressure and conversation. People who might have been hesitant to come forward years ago, maybe out of fear or some misplaced loyalty, they might feel compelled to speak up when the case is suddenly dominating headlines and conversations again.
So the podcast achieved a level of public saturation that the GBI on its own just couldn't maintain for a decade.
It couldn't. It essentially created an environment where a key piece of information, a single tip, was just more likely to surface.
And that momentum carried directly into 2017. Which leads us into the most pivotal section of this story, the breakthrough and the allegations. The breakthrough came in February of 2017, and it was based on that single critical tip received by the GBI.
And that tip led to the arrest of a man named Ryan Alexander Duke on February 23, 2017. He was charged with Grinstead's murder and the concealment of her body.
And the connection here was deeply unsettling for the community. Duke was identified as having attended Irwin County High School where Tara taught.
Yes, though the sources are specific that this was about 3 years before her disappearance, so he wasn't her student at the time. But he was part of that same small school community.
And the specificity of the charges, the ones filed in the warrants which were read aloud in court, they established the prosecution's initial theory of the crime. It painted a very particular picture of that night.
It did. The warrants alleged that Duke had been burglarizing Tara Grinstead's home. The crime turned violent, they alleged, when she unexpectedly caught him in the act.
And then?
He then allegedly strangled her, which caused her death, and then removed her body from the house. And that narrative provides a potential explanation for the lack of forced entry. Maybe he found an unlocked door, or the encounter began outside. It also explains the sudden, violent nature of an attack that left no sign of a struggle inside. This idea of a crime of opportunity during a burglary, that was the foundation of the case against him.
But the story quickly expanded. It wasn't just about a single person. Less than 2 weeks later, a second related arrest was made.
On March 3, 2017, the GBI arrested Bo Dukes. He was a former classmate of Ryan Duke, and the sources clarify they were not related despite the last name.
And Bo Dukes was charged with crimes related to the aftermath.
Yes, exactly. Attempting to conceal a death, hindering apprehension, and tampering with evidence. The charges clearly defined his alleged role as assisting in the cover-up, separate from the primary act of violence.
And the sources reveal that the arrest of Bo Dukes was particularly painful for Tara's surviving family.
It was, because of those small-town connections we talked about. Tara Grinstead's sister, Anita Gannis, she revealed that she had known Bo Dukes' family for years. She described the whole situation as just unreal. And that detail, it just underscores the reality that these crimes rarely happen in a vacuum. The lines of connection between a victim's family and the accused often overlap in these tight-knit rural communities, and it just compounds the shock and the sense of betrayal.
The legal pressure on Bo Dukes then intensified later that same year. In August of 2017, he faced more charges, and these stemmed from his initial interactions with investigators when the case was still cold.
A grand jury indicted him on 2 counts of making false statements, 1 count of hindering apprehension, and 1 count of concealing death. And these charges were based on the specific allegation that Dukes had lied to a GBI official during questioning back in 2016.
Which was right around the time the podcast was bringing all that new attention to the case.
Right when that was happening. And this demonstrated a history of obstruction. He wasn't just covering up the crime when he was finally arrested. The allegation was that he had actively misdirected authorities during the cold case phase, extending the investigation for no reason.
This moves us into the phase that ultimately lasted the longest. The legal proceedings and the complex verdicts. This covers 2017 all the way through the most recent appeals decision in 2025. And it all began with this immediate, high-stakes legal battle over the public's right to know.
The arrest generated immense local and national media scrutiny, just an incredible amount. And recognizing this, the judge in Irwin County, Judge Melanie Cross, she issued a gag order.
To protect Ryan Duke's right to a fair trial.
Yes, his Sixth Amendment right. And the order broadly prohibited anyone involved, prosecutors, defense attorneys, police, court staff, from discussing the case publicly outside of court.
And this immediately set up a collision with the First Amendment. With the press, media outlets wasted no time challenging that restriction.
Georgia television stations, WMAZ and WXIA, they spearheaded the challenge. They argued that in a case of such overwhelming public interest, a case involving a long-standing mystery and a beloved victim, that this kind of wholesale restriction on information was an overreach.
And Judge Cross did relax the order a little bit after that initial pushback, but she kept significant restrictions in place.
She did. And the media outlets felt that even the revised order was still too restrictive. So they took the argument to the highest state court. This is a critical constitutional fight that defines legal precedent.
It is. So WMAZ and WXIA successfully petitioned the Supreme Court of Georgia. They heard arguments in October 2017. And the core argument from the media was that pretrial publicity does not automatically mean an unfair trial.
Right. And that the public's right to monitor the administration of justice, especially in a high-profile case involving local law enforcement, that right outweighed the hypothetical risk of a contaminated jury pool.
And the Supreme Court of Georgia delivered a very definitive ruling on that specific constitutional tension.
Very definitive. In March 2018, the court ruled unanimously to overturn the gag order, to toss it out entirely. And a unanimous decision like that, it's a major victory for transparency. It affirms the principle that in our open court system, restrictions on speech, even those aimed at protecting the accused, have to be very narrowly tailored and rigorously justified.
And in this case, the Supreme Court found the gag order was just too broad.
Too broad and too restrictive. So with that path cleared, the trials could finally move forward, beginning with Bo Dukes, the individual charged with the cover-up.
His trial began on March 19th, 2019.
Yes, and the evidence presented really focused on his actions after Tara's death, his alleged role in moving the body, and his previous lies to the GBI. And the jury found him guilty for his role in concealing the death and hindering apprehension.
And his sentencing reflected the severity of that. Even without a direct link to the murder, the obstruction of justice was viewed very seriously.
It was. Just 3 days later, March 22, 2019, Bo Dukes was sentenced to 25 years in prison. It's a lengthy sentence, and it sends a powerful message that actively subverting justice, lying to law enforcement, and assisting in the disposal of a body, it carries immense penalties.
Then came the long and complex journey toward the trial of Ryan Duke, the accused killer. And that process was marked by some significant procedural delays.
His trial was initially set for April 1st, 2019. But just before it was set to begin, the Georgia Supreme Court intervened again and ordered a delay. And the reason was a challenge by Duke's defense team. They contended they were unconstitutionally denied the necessary state funds to hire expert witnesses for his defense.
Can you explain that point a bit? Why does denying funds for experts rise to the level of being unconstitutional?
It's a fundamental part of the American legal system. For an indigent defendant, someone who can't afford their own lawyer, especially when they're facing complex charges like murder, the state is required to provide the resources necessary for a complete defense. So if a case hinges on forensic evidence, like the DNA on the glove, and the defendant can't afford their own DNA expert to critique the prosecution's findings, then they are essentially being denied the ability to properly contest the evidence.
I see. So the Supreme Court recognized this fundamental requirement for resource parity for a fair trial.
Yes, and that led to the necessary delay.
And that delay pushed the trial back several years. It eventually started on May 9, 2022. During the trial itself, Duke's defense introduced a dramatic new narrative that fundamentally changed the dynamic between the two accused men.
It really did. Duke pleaded not guilty to the murder charges. But the strategic pivot was his trial testimony. He explicitly shifted the blame for the killing of Tara Grinstead onto Bo Dukes.
So you have a situation where the jury is forced to choose between the testimonies of two confessed accomplices in the concealment. One is now accusing the other of the actual murder.
Exactly. And the jury's eventual verdict, which was delivered on May 20, 2022, was undeniably complex. It proved they viewed the evidence in the testimony through a very specific, very narrow legal lens.
A split verdict that surprised a lot of people.
It did. Ryan Duke was found not guilty of the most severe charges: murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. But crucially, he was found guilty of the sole remaining charge: concealing a death.
And this finding is really the focal point for understanding the limitations of the justice system in this case. How does a jury simultaneously accept that a person concealed a body, proving they were involved in the crime's aftermath? You find there isn't enough evidence to prove they were the one who committed the murder or the burglary that led to it.
It reflects the difference in the burden of proof required for the charges. To convict him of murder or burglary, the jury had to believe beyond a reasonable doubt that Duke committed the act of violence or the act of breaking and entering.
And they didn't.
They likely concluded he was involved in disposing of the body, perhaps based on his own testimony or other evidence which proved concealment. However, they must have found sufficient reasonable doubt about who delivered the fatal blow, especially with him pointing the finger at Bo Dukes. The prosecution's theory that Duke was the killer in a botched burglary. It must have failed to meet that highest legal standard, even though the jury clearly believed he was an active participant in the cover-up.
And 3 days after that verdict, Ryan Duke was sentenced for that one specific conviction.
On May 23, 2022, he received the maximum allowable sentence for concealing a death: 10 years in prison, which places his sentence significantly lower than the 25 years Bo Dukes received, whose charges also included lying to authorities and tampering with evidence.
The legal complexities didn't even end there, though. The system continued to churn through appeals and secondary charges right up to the present.
Right. It's demonstrated by the final detail in our timeline. On February 27, 2025, an appeals court threw out additional charges that had been brought against both men in Ben Hill County. Now, it's essential to note, while those specific additional charges were dismissed, that decision did not overturn their original sentences for concealing the death.
It just speaks to the technical, persistent nature of complex litigation long after the primary trials are over. So that brings us to our final analysis. We have to synthesize the narrative of this truly extraordinary case and reflect on its duration and its outcome.
When you span the 2 decades of this case, from that 2005 disappearance to the 2025 appeals court decision, what emerges is just a picture of immense, sustained effort. The case was defined by the persistence of the GBI, who were often struggling against years of silence, and then, crucially, the revitalizing influence of that non-traditional media and community engagement.
And yet, the justice that was delivered, as we've discussed, was fragmented. The jurors delivered convictions only for the acts committed after the death, not for the act of violence itself.
This is the central enigma of the case.
Yeah.
The jury's decision to acquit Ryan Duke of murder but convict him of concealment, it highlights a critical reality in criminal law. Proof of a consequence does not automatically constitute proof of causation.
Meaning?
They found conclusive evidence of a cover-up, of obfuscation on the part of both men, but the identity of the principal offender, the actual killer, could not be established beyond a reasonable doubt, especially when your key witnesses are also involved in the crime and are actively blaming each other.
This outcome, where the full truth of Tara Grinstead's final hours may have been obscured by years of deceit, it provides a challenging final observation for you to consider.
The determination of fact inside a courtroom, especially in a case like this that relies so heavily on circumstantial evidence and delayed testimony, it is strictly defined by legal statutes and the evidence presented. It's not always defined by the collective certainty of the community or even the investigators. And the partial verdicts in the Grinstead case demonstrate the limitations inherent when the ultimate truth relies on the accounts of individuals who themselves were actively engaged in concealing that truth for years.
Thank you for examining this difficult and complicated case with us.
Thanks for listening.